what I'm going to do to start us out is I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my changes over the last 35 years as a therapist. And, it's funny, there's a couple people who've influenced me dramatically and almost changed the way I think and work. The first was John Bowlby, who I was lucky enough to study with years ago. And then Masters and Johnson, who I work with. And then Bessel. Bessel and I became friends 35 years ago, and he's been just awesome over that period of time. Just love the guy. And then Dick Schwartz has worked with us for about a year and did co-therapy with me for that period of time, and it was sort of a gift from heaven. And he's next Wednesday if you get a chance. And then, recently I've brought Noah Levine to town because I worked with him in LA, and he the whole Buddhist recovery movement really touched me. I've always felt like we needed something as an alternative to 12-step or in addition to. And the Buddhist recovery, when I was in LA, there were 2,000 people going to Noah's meetings a week. And it just blew me off the chair. And of course, when I reread all the Buddhist literature, it seemed to me that all we've done is reinvented the wheel, with acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness and all that business. So anyway, we've started a refuge recovery group on Mondays, which is a free group that we offer to the community. So if you have anybody who might benefit, that'd be good. And it's so good to see many of my old friends. I feel like I'm having a party here. Lee Larimore is here from Beacon House, and he and I run he runs it, and I attend it, which is an attachment work, basically a study group. And I just love his work, and I love what Beacon House is doing, and we're really fortunate to have them as a resource. Just love what he does. Really a senior clinician. And many of the rest of you, I'm just really appreciative to see you again. Anyway, I won't overdo this, but let me just get right to it, which is that one of the things that blew me away more than anything else is that Alan Srofe wrote a book last year called The Development of the Child. And he had been funded by NIH for 30 years. And he followed a group of 180 children of poverty from in the time they were in the womb until they were 30 years old every year, and tested them with everything you could test them with, tested every member of their family with everything you could test them with, went to their schools and studied their teachers and looked at what they did in the playground and put them in camp every year and studied them in camp. And what he found, it's like that old Dodge commercial, this changes everything. What he found was that 40% of the parents who experienced childhood abuse, maltreatment, another 30% provided borderline care, the remaining 30% had 30 emotional support from the alternative. So basically what that means is that about 80 or 90% of the people had some sort of emotional abuse. And what he found, bottom line, is that the history of physical abuse is virtually never related to a positive outcome. That if they have had a trauma during childhood, the most likely outcome is disorganized attachment at 18 months of age. And if you follow them at age 30, the outcome very highly is related to a dissociative disorder, a disorder of self. And there are multiple pathways. So you can look at it like it's a kind of like a set of dominoes. The first thing happens, then the second thing happens, the third thing happens. And so it's a developmental disorder, and anything can change it along the way. So everything that happens to a person affects them. And so when you say, what's the cause of this or that disorder, it's always a sequential developmental event. And then children with disorganized attachments have fragmented sense of self. And so if you go back to Winnicott and Kohut, the ego psychologist, basically these are disorders of self with a heavy dissociative component. And so disorganized attachment predicts later psychopathology. So in effect what I'm saying is that the first clarity that I've had is that when we ran the eating disorder program in St. Louis, the first thing I did was give the adult attachment interview to the first 100 patients. And what I found was that there were 0% of them who had secure attachment, and there were about only 90% who had disorganized attachment. And so I decided that what I wanted to do is I wanted to focus my intervention on bringing disorganized attachment towards earned secure attachment. And that became sort of my mission on an empirical basis. And so the question is, how do you do that? And that's going to be part of what I'm calling intimacy and intimacy disorder. So as I'm trying to find an operational way of thinking about intimacy, most of my clients over the years will say things like, I don't think I love the way you love, or the way I see other people love. There's something about the way I love that doesn't seem like other people. Client would say, when I'm with other people, I feel alone. And so there is a level of disconnection. And then when I'd say to an addict, what are you afraid would happen if you would give up your addiction? They would say, I'm afraid I would be alone. And so it seemed to me that the sine qua non of what I was doing was helping people be able to build connection. And it always felt to me that, like, if a person gave up their alcoholism, that you're sentenced into a life of aloneness, and that's where AA came in, was it gave them a community and a connection. And so what we had to do is to help them move from disconnected to connected. So, that was called receiving love. And what do you do to open up the receptors so a person can receive love and then reciprocate love? And that became sort of the core of the attachment. And so the reason I think this changes everything is that it takes sort of theoretical, like, first of all, what Schwartz concluded was that the live experience of children predicts the presence of later disturbance. And so what that means is that he can predict who's going to be depressed and who's going to be anxious. And he can do that at 18 months of age. That is mind-blowing. And the individual pathways can be described and are probabilistically related to forms of disturbance. And so when our DSM is not ideologically or developmentally based, it's more phenomenological. And as a psychology person, what you're interested in is looking at the developmental pathways and how they affect the brain, which then affects the behavior and so on. And the disturbance is step by step. And the earliest robust markers of a pathogenic experience or maladaptive developmental pathway lie in the infant-caregiver relationship. And so people always say, oh, you're blaming the parents. It's not that you're blaming the parents, it's that what happens between the infant and the caretakers is critical for adult psychopathology. And since most people don't remember that, or remember it even accurately, the question is, how do you reconstruct that? And this is a key piece for me, which is, as has been noted previously, disturbance in early childhood is best characterized as a relational disturbance, not a disturbance in the infant or toddler. And so the medical model is the patient is sick and has a disturbance. And what I'm trying to say is that it's not that the patient is sick, it's that they carry a relational disturbance, and that needs to be our target. So what I've always wanted was a DSM of relational disturbances rather than of the individual. And so that's why I call it intimacy and intimacy disorder, because we need a phenomenological approach to looking at these kinds of things. Now, just to piggyback to Bessel, I thought by doing trauma work that people would get better. When I was, a young whippersnapper, I noticed that, about 98% of the people who came to psychiatric hospitals, had been traumatized, raped, abused, neglected in varieties of ways, and it wasn't being treated adequately. And so Dr. Masters and I went, and began to study the World War I literature and look at what people did back in World War I for trauma, and that's when Bessel and I became friends. And I thought, well, if I treat the trauma, people will get better. And so I set up a trauma program and learned and did the best I could. And what I discovered after 15 or 20 years was that I could do really good trauma work, and that was really important in people's recovery, but they didn't get better. Okay? And that, it was sort of back to the drawing board, which is that trauma work was necessary but never sufficient. And so the question is, what was I missing? What was the piece of the puzzle that I was missing? And I went back to Bessel and I said, Bessel, you're the leader in this field. You have to tell people that, yes, we can treat PTSD effectively, but that's not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient. And so what is it that that I was missing was the question. So here it is. My teacher once said to me, if you can teach people 2 or 3 things in a lecture, you're probably more successful than most. So just tell them what you want them to know, and then the rest of the time just tell them stories. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so this is what I want you to know. We slowly split off parts of self, and that's the psychodynamic contribution. As that happens, our unconscious gets bigger and our conscious becomes so, if I take my own personal development, as I've become more integrated and I've owned the disowned parts of self, my capacity to be happy has increased kind of dramatically. And so, empirically this seems to be true. Okay, so as our unconscious gets bigger as we split off parts of self, as that happens we start being defensive. And so the kinds of ways we get defensive is heavily on the controlling end, which is where addicts come in. Or we become narcissistic and self-involved as a defense. Or we become symbiotic, dependent on other people. Codependency is the major addiction. And most of these defenses are ways that we protect ourselves from danger. Okay? So, the way I do therapy is that the way I am with myself and with my clients is that when their defenses become manifested, they become mindful and they're able to step back from it and be able to say, look, I'm angry right now, or right now I'm reactive right now, or right now I'm defensive right now I'm controlling right now. And they become metacognitive, meaning that they look at it from an airplane down and they begin to step back from it and say, what's going on with me? And of course the best way to elicit defenses is to get married, right? And that's the joy of a relationship, is that, they drive you crazy. Okay, so then what happens is that as we do that, our defenses get bigger, we start denying our needs. And the best thing is not to need anybody. And so, if you don't mind my personalizing, when I was 12, my father dropped dead. And soon my mother died after that. And so I got very constricted and I pulled into myself. And I remember I bought a Volkswagen bus and I put everything I owned in it. And I said, if I don't need anybody, I won't be hurt. And, I drove, a few thousand miles. And I realized that I was so lonely, I was about ready to jump out of my skin. And I thought, this isn't going to work, all right? And most of my clients, have gone through a similar kind of thing. And so the natural defense to being hurt is to say, if you don't need, and if you don't have needs, you can't be hurt and disappointed, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So then we have this emptiness inside, which is, from all the things that have not happened, all the neglect you've had in childhood and all the abuse creates these emptiness inside. And what we try to do is fill it with money, work, spending, starving, all kinds of addictions. And so addictions are always about disorders of self and inner emptiness. And so the question is, how does one fill the inner emptiness? It's like a black hole, and the black hole sucks up. Then you have self-rejection, self-hatred, so clients come in and they hate themselves, they feel like they're perfectionistic, they're never going to be good enough, and self-hatred is always about the past. And it's always a flashback, which means that if you follow it, it will lead you right to where you need to go in the therapy process. And then you meet somebody and you take these disowned parts of self and you project them on others. So Harwell Hendricks' contribution was to say that when you get into a relationship, the very best things that happen to you as a child and the very worst thing that happened to you as a child gets projected on your ideal mate, and that causes a reenactment. And one of the things about Bessel was he was the very first person 30 years ago who talked about reenactment and repetition compulsion. And so, the Freud's concept of repetition compulsion is what makes all of us go. And, what I realized as a marital therapist was that the problem that clients brought in was never the problem. It was a problem, but it wasn't the problem. And that the problem they brought on was always a projection of the person who hurt them the most during childhood on their partner. And that was an incredible realization. And then finally, the result of all this is you end up resisting the gifts of connection and positive. And so, I love you. I'll show you I'm unlovable. I care about you. I don't allow anybody to care about me because I don't care about myself. And so I was trained as a marital therapist, and everybody as a marital therapist is trying to work on the relationship between two people and looking at their communication and their anger management, their problem solving, and all that jazz. And it occurred to me that you have to have an I before you have a we, and that the real mistake was that in order to do marital therapy, the key was to begin to work on the relationship within the individual. And so, if it's a relational disturbance, and if it is a disorder of self, and if Kohut and Winnicott are right, and then came Mary Main, and what she said was, the key to secure attachment is developing a cohesive, coherent, collaborative narrative. And that what was necessary for a person was to begin to integrate these separated, dissociated parts of self. So Schroff on this end is saying that childhood trauma results in disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment is a disorder of self and is always about dissociated parts. Winnicott and Kohut are saying in self-psychology that these parts need to be integrated. And then Bessel comes in and says the things that keeps dissociated parts from integrating is trauma. So you do trauma work and you begin to change the parts of self that have these negative cognitions of self. So cognitive therapy is the key. So if you get trained in EMDR, the key in EMDR is the cognitive interweave. And what you're going to be able to do when you get state-dependent memory activated is beginning to change the cognitions and the beliefs of parts of self. And then the key then is beginning to integrate these parts of self, re-own them, and help the person feel more integrated. And the result of that is a cohesive sense of self that then makes the person begin to like themselves. Okay? And that's necessary not only with addicts, but in most marital therapies, what people are doing is you're seeing a manifestation of that. So they changed the way I did marital therapy because I was always trained in a co-therapy model. So Lori and I work as a team. She would work with a woman, I would work with a man, and both of us would work with a relationship. But what we started to do was much more individual therapy in the context of couples therapy. I would work with a man and do a piece of work around his trauma while his wife was watching. Then she would do a piece of work with the woman while the man and I were watching, and then we would integrate that. And the woman would say, God, I thought it was about me, but it's really about his mother, isn't it? And it's like, there's the $1 million insight. And as soon as that happens, everything begins to change. All right, so then Dick Schwartz comes in, which is that what he says, because I'm trying to build self. It's like, how do you help a person who has no self? They come in and they're eating disorder. I am anorexia. I am alcoholic. I am a heroin addict. That's who they are, not what they do. And so it's their whole identity. And they say, it's funny, I feel like I don't want to leave my addiction behind because I need it, almost like I feel lonely without it and I feel like it's a romantic partner. And I say, what? It's like your heroin addiction is your spouse. It's like, what does this mean? And so, it didn't fit logically into anything I could understand. But I knew that if I took it away, the whole self felt disintegrated in some way. And so the key was understanding what they were saying and listening to them well. Because if you are afraid to connect with people, it's reasonable that you're going to look for some other way to feel connected and safe. And you're going to grab onto anything that walks by that helps you feel connected and safe. because that's the way our brains are built. They want to feel connected and safe. And so if heroin is what does it, you're going to grab heroin. If anorexia is going to grab you, it will. And if you're an exhibitionist, you're going to expose yourself. So what I came to realize was that the mistake we made was separating addictions. Treating alcoholism, heroin, eating disorder, and sex addiction, and gambling as separate is a mistake, because these addictions have much more in common than they have separate. And like AA is great for alcoholics, but these process addictions, there's like 40 million or plus of them in the United States, and there's not a good place for people to go for self-help in that kind of a way, at least, resource-wise. So if you think about it, refuge recovery kind of concept is a good one, because we welcome all addictions, and we see it sort of as more similar than different. Now, what Dick says is, this is self. Self has to do with these C words. I think curiosity is missing, but these key C words are what we're all born with, and that what we're looking for is beginning to kind of take the clouds away so the sun shines through. So the clouds are all the defenses that we've developed out of fear, and as you move those defenses back, more and more self is available. And so the model became subtractive rather than additive. I don't have to teach a person to have a self. So when a person comes in and their addiction is who they are, you don't have to help them develop a sense of self. What you have to do is remove the defenses that have blocked the sun. Okay, you see the difference in that model? All right, so the model became more of what Dick would call self-parenting. And this is kind of our preview event of Coming Events Wednesday, which is that we all have self, and the job of the therapist is to catalyze the relationship between self and the injured part. And so you are, as a therapist, not directly fixing the client in that way. What you're doing is you're promoting self-healing. Promoting self-healing. That's a whole different kind of way to think about it. Now, what I'm trying to say is that Dr. Masters, who was my teacher, was a gynecologist. And he'd say, oh, I'm going to go over to the hospital right now and catch babies. And his idea was he didn't deliver babies, he would catch babies. And I like that metaphor because in some ways, people heal themselves and you facilitate the process. But if you step in and try to heal the person, then you become the codependent, you become part of the system. So the nice thing about this is that you're promoting self-healing, and so what you're encouraging is for the client to be there. So the client said to me, it's like I'm driving the bus and all my parts are in the back. And so sometimes, one of the kids screams, I'm hungry, I want to eat. And I'm able to say, okay, honey, we'll get you some food. Another part says, I don't like him, he's mean to us. And you're able to say, yes, honey, I'll help you deal with this. And so we want somebody always driving the bus, and that's self. Isn't that a nice metaphor? And so your parts jump out. Dick says they hijack the body, and they hijack the mind. And so just so it doesn't become too esoteric, at Thanksgiving I go back and visit my family. And when I get to my family, I would notice that I couldn't talk. And everybody would be talking but me, and everyone was used to it because I just didn't talk. I thought to myself, I'm not myself when I'm with my family. So, I'm a kind of recovering cognitive behavioral therapist. So I wrote down okay, when you're with your family, here are the 5 things you want to remember. Blah, 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 blah. I took a little card with me, my potato when I'm looking at that. And I realized I couldn't talk. And then it occurred to me, I felt like I was 13 years old, which is right when my father died. Duh. And when I was with her, I had this trigger, and I couldn't hold on to myself. And so when these happen within yourself, you realize that these dissociated parts are really powerful. And, they come in and they hijack you, and you lose voluntary control. So I call that a pop quiz. So your parts come in highly triggers. And so triggers are gifts. And I like triggers. And so when there's a trigger, I'm looking for the gift. And so when my client comes in and they have symptoms or they have distress, I think of that in a reframing kind of way as a gift. And so I start my session by saying, tell me a little bit of what's happened over the last week. And I listen really well and for what pops out. And the person says, my girlfriend was, I don't know whether I should stay with her or not stay with her. It's like my mother, she's so controlling and she's always telling me what to do. And for once, I just want to feel like someone's taking care of me rather than I'm taking care of them. Ooh, there's a gift, right? And he's crying in my office. There's a gift. So all that affect is really, it's like a therapist's dream. So you don't want to fix it in that matter. What you want to be able to do is attune yourself to it and be able to say, okay, so what's happening is your mom this, your girlfriend that, your girlfriend is the trigger, let's go for it. And now you do your work. You see the frame? Mm-hmm. And so the gift is being able to see what the client brings into you in some way. And so who's driving the bus? You want to begin to have him work with that injured part of self that was activated by his mother. And the trauma work is to take the past and bring it into the 50-minute hour. And activating the affect of the mother, and what happened between the boy and the mother is like that, easy. And as you're able to do that, you're able to this time he's going to go through the experience, but this time the adult self is going to be with the injured part of self and help them begin to recognize cognitively and affectively what was going on then. And so instead of concluding that you're bad and that you don't deserve love and that every woman's going to hurt you, which is reasonable, you begin to correct the irrational responses in some way. So there's a blending of trauma work that then comes as part of. Now you can do EMDR, you can do internal family systems, you can do affect accelerated therapy, you can do hypnosis, you can do Gestalt work, you can do Ericksonian work. Whatever it is you do, it's all the same stuff. Everyone keeps reinventing the wheel, but it's all affect-based work. And when someone gives you the gift of all that affect, you have to be able to know what to do with it, rather than trying to just sort of fix it in some way. All right, so here, in the self-parenting, the hardest thing sometimes is being able to teach healthy boundaries. And so, that's a cognitive behavioral approach. So even though I'm a recovering cognitive behavioral therapist, what I'm saying is cognitive behavioral therapy is always necessary, but never sufficient. And affect-based therapies are useful, and trauma-based therapies are useful, and the cognitive restructuring piece is always part of the therapy. So what we're doing is we're blending models, and each of these models become useful in some way. Now, the next sort of piece of this puzzle for me came from the work on attachment. And Dan Brown, who I brought in last year, was training the adult attachment interview with Lori and I. And he set out in the same way we did to try to understand what promotes secure attachment. And then he wrote this book called Disturbances of Attachment, which is like completely blew me off my feet. A book like that, it's like one of the 5 top books I've ever read. And what he said, actually, I knew it, but I never heard it articulated this way, which was that what is secure attachment? Because reparenting is developing a secure attachment with self. So what you have to do is feel a sense of felt safety and protection from danger. That's control. You have to have a sense of being seen and known. So you have these parts have to feel like you really see them and know them, and that's not an easy task. Experience of felt comfort with soothing and reassurance, and so self-soothing and being able to talk to yourself in a reassuring way when you feel scared. A sense of being valued. This is the one that I love so much, which is the little kid comes in with their tutu on, you're able to say, "Oh, you look so beautiful! Oh," and she says, and to me, that's that's it, that's the basic it, where the child feels like I am the most beautiful person in the world and feels delighted in the individual. And then a sense of potential for new possibilities for growth and becoming oneself, unconditional support. So each struggle, so in the Buddhist tradition, pain is necessary, suffering is optional. And so you're able to notice the pain and not try to run from it or avoid it, but instead embrace it and be able to grow from it in some ways. The number one block to secure attachment is, drum roll, is loyalty to the family. And so what happens is that when the client comes in, their defenses are, I didn't have it so bad. And it wasn't as bad as other people. And my parents loved me, they just weren't perfect. Okay? And all that is about minimization and denial. And all of it keeps us from being able to recognize what happened to us. And in a developmental model, being able to re-own, disown parts of self means that you're able to re-experience at some level what happened to them, rather than what's wrong with them. And so what you're trying to be able to do in this ideal parent model is imagine if you had ideal parents, what they might be like. And as you're able to do this in the ideal parent paradigm, usually you get resistance. The client begins to get very upset because in some ways you're saying that my parents weren't perfect or ideal as they begin to realize what that is. And so one of our favorite homework assignments is to say to a client that see if you can do a pictorial diagram or a collage of what you would like your child's childhood to be like, and put that on one side, and then do a collage of what your childhood was like and put it on the other side, and present it in group. And of all the assignments, and Lori came up with this one, this is the one that seems to activate more of the affect because you're dealing with the minimization and denial around family of origin. Most psychotherapies that are evidence-based are trying to remove symptoms. And yay, we can help depression. Yay, we can help anxiety. But that is not treatment. That's the first stage of treatment. You've got to get the symptom under relative control in order to be able to do the work. So thank God for medication, because medication helps me begin to do my work. But medication is not the treatment. It's the first stage of treatment. 12-step is the first stage of treatment. Cognitive behavior work is the first stage of treatment. And so I try to map recovery. So what I did is I looked in the literature and I tried to find anything that exists on mapping recovery. And there isn't anything out there. There's no addict that knows what the stages of recovery really consist of. All right, so I started thinking in that way. 2 is you have to address the underlying trauma. Trauma is, we know now from the ACE study that, most people have about 3 major traumas in their life, and Bessel will be telling you about that. Not all PTSD trauma, but trauma does not have to be PTSD trauma to have a major effect on you. 3, that if you've had trauma, which we all have, or neglect, there's going to be a repetition, compulsion, reenactment, and projection in relationships. And it's a relational disturbance, not just a disturbance of the individual. And we have to help people develop secure attachment. Okay? So those are all 4 components of treatment. Then part of developing secure attachment is having emotional regulation and being able to deal with affect. And so what Strove found was that if you have avoidant attachment, see, disorganized attachment is a combination of avoidant attachment and anxious attachment. So, you withdraw and you pull away and you restrict, and then you're so hungry that you go and you binge. You do that on people, you do it on food, you do it on sex, the whole kit and caboodle, right? So what happens then is the avoidance side is, I don't need anybody, I'm going to be alone. And then after you become starved for it, the anxious attachment side, says, I need to cling, I need somebody to want me, I need to meet my needs. And so they drive you crazy, right? So, we then call that bipolar, but we're all kind of bipolar. So, in this, what Strove found was that if you take the people who are avoidant at age 18 months, what do you think the probability of them developing an anxiety disorder is at age 30? 0. If you have anxious attachment, the probability of you developing an anxiety disorder is about 80%. Okay? So we pick up anxiety from our mirror neurons, from our caretakers. As they get scared, we get scared. And we begin to be fearful and anxious because of our early disposition, because, there are dispositions we're born with genetically. And some of us are very sensitive and reactive, and therefore, basically react to our environment very much. And kids sometimes push their parents away. Okay? Now, if you follow these avoidants, what are they like then at age, let's say, 16? At age 16, if you go out and study them, the girls, whenever they have sex, they say, I don't feel anything. My body is numb. And I don't get turned on like other people get turned on. And I feel like there's something wrong with me. Okay? So what does that tell you? That avoidant attachment is not just like here, but the whole body becomes desensitized in some way. So the somatic approaches are precious because it gets people not only in their body, but feeling their feelings. So the mindfulness is much more important. And what you're doing is you're actually drilling new pathways, because when people are numb, that's because these parts of the brain have not developed. And so, the work that's being done on brain development, Dan Siegel's kind of review, is that what we're seeing developmentally is there are brain correlates to everything that I'm talking about here. So what we're doing is literally drilling new parts in the brain. Now, that's called exposure therapy. So in exposure therapy, what you have to do is get people to do what they're avoiding and feel what they're not feeling. And you can't do that in a 50-minute hour. And so I realized what I needed was life coaches to begin to work with them in the evenings and the weekends, in between the sessions, to be able to do things that were, they didn't know how to play. They didn't know how to laugh. They didn't know how to be silly. They didn't know how to connect socially. They didn't even know how to go into Target. So there were so many things that they weren't doing. And as a therapist, you're not allowed to go out of your office because that's bad boundaries, right? You can't go to their house. But life coaches can. So I began to integrate kind of occupational therapy into this. And occupational therapists, are kind of masters at this. And if it's a disorder of self, then we have to look at self, gender, and eroticism, because it's a much broader thing than just a disorder of self. So many people today come in and they call themselves queer, which usually means that they don't know who they are or what they are. And they don't know how to label themselves, so they're not going to. And they don't have an anchor of self, and they're very, very confused. And then there's the development of the actual life skills, which is the life coaching piece. And then there's the capacity for genuine intimacy and not reenacting or repeating or projecting on the dissonant parts of self. So you see how you conceptualize the pieces of this? Now I can begin to say, what is recovery? Because recovery is a journey, and what you're trying to be able to do is ask yourself in your session today, which of these components am I working on? And how do I do it? What's the cookbook of how I'm going to work on gender? What's the cookbook of how I'm going to deal with reenactment? What's the cookbook of how I'm going to do emotional regulation? Now, they're all therapies that sort of take pieces of this puzzle, but it's the full gestalt that was really critical to me. And so, what happened was, Lori and I moved here from St. Louis, and we did that because we ran an inpatient program, and then we ran a residential program, and about 75% of people relapse. And it was really tiring to see people relapse. It's not, we did good work, but it wasn't enough. It was necessary, but it was not sufficient. So we'd say, oh, we'll just send them back to the outpatient therapist and they'll handle the rest. Like, duh, it's so unfair. And so what we needed was to begin to look at what we weren't doing. And so we developed this intensive outpatient program where we see people, for 6 hours a day, and then we send them back to their homes or their living environments, or a therapeutic community. We have a house where they can live in if they want to, as a therapeutic community. And we have people who work with them in between the sessions to be able to help them. And we're trying to work on all these components. And it's insurance friendly in the sense that, most insurance companies find that it's cheaper to send them to a partial program than to a residential program. So they're friendly to it. So it's a win-win situation. Okay, so finally, the steps in treatment. So this is a little bit overwhelming, so let's get it down to steps. All right, number one, experience safe attachment to an attuned therapist. If you have a therapist who has avoidant attachment, then you're going to feel really comfortable if you're avoidant, but I don't know if you're going to get better. And so the first thing is for the therapist to look at themselves. And I'll tell you a story about this, which is, Lori and I did this intensive training with Dick Schwartz. And, when he said you're born with self, every ounce of my body as a psychologist said, that isn't true. We're not born with self. Self is something that develops within a cultural perspective. And so I'm a rebel. I just wanted to fight him. And what I realized as time went on was that I had been trained as an empiricist and evidence-based and all that stuff. And so what would happen is that if a person came in with a certain symptom, my brain would go back and look at the literature and study what the evidence-based approach was and try to do the intervention and da-da-da-da. And I realized that I'm a healer and that all my being a healer had been wiped out of me by becoming an empiricist. So a psychologist is supposed to be a scientist, And I realized that I wasn't in the room anymore. That my part of myself that was a psychologist was in the room doing the work. And so I became a technician. And I became a good technician, but I was a terrible therapist. And so what I had to do literally was, Dick taught us how to get your psychologist self to step back and to get your healing self to come forward. And so, in meditation and a variety of other ways that he works, which he'll teach you, he works with the therapist and helps them bring self into the room. And self has an enormous amount of energy, and so what you're trying to get is self to self. So what would happen is, I would learn from Dick and I would do exactly what he did, word for word, but the patient wouldn't get better. So then Dick would come in and he would do a session with me, and I'd watch him do the exact same thing, and the client got remarkably better. And so what I noticed was that it was the energy that was going between him and the client. And I could feel the energy. I mean, literally, you could light a match with it. It was so powerful. Because when he was in self, which you'll feel when he's here, and the client was in self, which he was able to facilitate, so much happened. Now, that's really important, because that's attunement. Attunement is when you can love and care about. And it's in a younger therapist, sometimes, they're so busy learning how to be a therapist that they forget that the key to therapy is bringing yourself in the room and self to self, and loving and caring about a person unconditionally is always the curative agent. Now we know that, but what I had forgotten was that because there's such an emphasis on time-limited, empirical, evidence-based, blah, 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 that I had lost myself. Okay? And, that was like a big step for me. 2 is establishing control out of out-of-control behavior. You can't work with a person who's drinking a fifth of whiskey a day successfully in psychotherapy. And so, but that's the next step. People say, well, you can't really do psychotherapy while somebody's detoxing. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Yeah, people are different. 3, increasing ability to remember and experience emotions of past trauma. So it's a reconstructive process. And the question is, if you can't remember your childhood, and, memory's fallible, then how do you work with a client? And how do you know that you're not working with false memory? And who wants to work with false memory? And the answer to that, which all of us have had to figure out for ourselves, is that what one has to do is allow the pieces of the puzzle to emerge. So I'll use myself as an example. When I was doing therapy, it was 35 years ago, so the therapist used hypnosis. And it took me back, and I remembered this story where a policeman was bringing me home, and I was really little. And so I called my sister, who's older than me, and I said, do you remember anything about me and a policeman when I was a child? She said, oh, it's so interesting you remember that. She said, well, you were so young, like you could barely walk. At 10 o'clock at night, the doorbell rang, and there was a policeman, and they brought you home, and they had found you like 20 miles away from home. And no one knew you were gone, and no one knew how you got there. And I thought to myself, oh. Oh. Because what I remember is I was the fourth of 4 children. I was not exactly wanted or desired. And everyone was tired of having kids. And, I was a little rascal, and nobody was going to give me attention until I was misbehaved. And so, I would do things to drive people crazy because that was the only way I'd get noticed in some ways, right? And I'm kind of like that now. Not as much as Bessel, but that Bessel almost makes me look normal. But anyway, that becomes like a piece of a puzzle, and each of those pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together. And the goal was taking each of these pieces of the puzzle, trying to validate it with history. So my favorite way to validate is to bring families in. I love bringing mother in, father in, brother in, sister in. Anybody will talk to me, next door neighbor, and talk to them on the phone. People will tell you anything on the damn phone. It's amazing. And so when a client comes in, I ask permission to get as many numbers as I can, and I just talk to people on the phone. And anybody will talk back to me, I'll listen to. And each of that becomes, because you're able to get, like the elephant from many different pictures and positions, and all that, systemic work. So am I a behavior therapist? Yes. Am I a cognitive therapist? Yes. Am I an affective therapist? Yes. Am I a systemic therapist? Yes. Am I a gestalt therapist? Yes. Am I, you know what I mean? You just get, as you get in this stuff, you just keep growing and grabbing the next piece and being able to pull it in and getting better at doing the pieces of it. But the important thing is to know that each of them is necessary, but none of them is sufficient. Then you begin to narrate the emerging story. And so part of a secure attachment is having a cohesive, coherent, collaborative narrative. So there's a whole form of therapy called narrative therapy. And so there has to be a group that involves narrative therapy and allowing people to put their narrative into a cohesive format. There has to be an attachment group which helps people begin to understand how to develop secure attachment. There has to be an addictions group which teaches people relapse prevention. So each of these can be put into a component and then put into a 6-hour day. And then you want to gain mastery over reenactments by beginning to look at your triggers and your defenses and be able to do, basically what they're calling now acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a really, it's a Buddhist really approach and a mindfulness approach. But it's being able to be enough in your body that you can feel and notice and become metacognitional. So one of the ingredients of helping people become securely attached is metacognitional therapy. And so there's a whole variety of books on metacognitive therapy for borderline personality, metacognitive therapy for bipolar personality, and so on. And basically what they're saying is it's just good old psychotherapy where you're able to help the person notice what they're thinking and feeling and step back from it and be able to say, hey, what's up? So whoever's driving the bus can say to the part, hey, what's up? Why are you doing what you're doing? What are you supposed to do if you stop? How can we help you? How are you in the past? How are you in the present? All those good kinds of things. All plain old good psychotherapy. Then beginning to look at the cognitive distortions, then you begin to do schema therapy. Jeffrey Young, his schema therapy is just really good stuff. And what he realizes in the schema therapy, he says, I worked with Beck for a number of years. We did cognitive therapy. It was great. It was really empirical. But it didn't work with personality disorders. And guess what? All my clients have personality disorders. So Beck's therapy was necessary, but it was never sufficient. Well, that's amazing, because everyone knows that cognitive therapy is the treatment of choice, right, for depression. It isn't. Okay, but schema therapy is. And schema therapy is where he's going into these deep structures and looking at, he identifies the schemas and begins to really activate affect in your 50-minute session and begin to right into the amygdala and begin to restructure the amygdala so that you begin to get changes. There's a woman in San Francisco who does trauma work, and she does PET scans to evaluate her effectiveness. And what she does is one group gets trauma work like Bessel does, and one does trauma work plus attachment work. And what she found was that the ones who did trauma work, the trauma stayed in the amygdala, it didn't go up into the hippocampus and get consolidated. But the ones who did trauma plus attachment work, she could see it consolidating up into the hippocampus and going into long-term memory. So she was saying that what we need to be able to do is use PET scans to evaluate the effectiveness of psychotherapy. But it was so beautiful that you could see that trauma work is useful, but trauma plus attachment work really results in lots of integration. And it's really beautiful kind of work. And when Bessel's here, he's going to be showing you how this happens in the brain. Because, like, we all know that it's effective, but when you can see it in the brain, like we become real, like, doctors, And we all want to be real doctors. Okay. So, then we're restoring opportunities for learning life skills. All this is good, but, most of us have structural deficits. We didn't learn things at age 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16. And we don't have the brain structure to know how to do those. And so we're all child therapists. And what happens with child therapists is there are structural deficits. And so most recently what I've been trying to do is read the child literature and begin to work with what happens with children as it manifests itself with adults. Hey, Bessel.
Hey.
Welcome.
Hi.
I'm priming for you. I'm like the startup band.
Oh, you're the warm-up.
Yeah. And what I'm telling them is that attachment work on top of trauma work is really good stuff. Come on up. This is my last slide.
Right.
So this is Bessel van der Kolk.
So, I'd like to give all of this a context. The context that we all are a part of, because culture shapes who we are, what we see, what we know. And what's very important for the culture that we live in is that our understanding of PTSD was almost entirely colored by the fact that we're the most militaristic society since the Romans back in the year 200. Most of our treasure goes to arming people, killing people around the world. And it is an astounding issue that nobody really seems to talk about our priorities, whether we really want to be people who primarily go and invade other countries, or whether we want to have a more other reallocation of resources, rather relevant to the issue of trauma. For example, when you go to a place like Australia, Denmark, Holland, Finland, Singapore, Korea, Sweden, you really find no poverty. And you find that people in those countries, the kids score much higher on their tests. And that is because they actually believe in science in those places. And so oftentimes when I go to those places, I get a phone call from the local Ministry of Health that says, oh, you're this trauma guy from the US, because most of the good work gets done over here, interestingly enough. And they say, so could you come and spend an afternoon at the ministry to see what the latest findings are in child abuse and family violence and stuff like that, so we can incorporate this into our laws and change our policies to go to incorporate the understanding of science. I always liked those meetings, and I think as a result, a country like the Netherlands, where I grew up and has become a very nice place after I left, has an incarceration rate of 68 per 100,000 people. In the US, where we don't pay attention to stuff like this, our incarceration rate is 990 per 100,000 people. So there is a certain price you pay for not paying attention to science and to what's really going on and stuff like that. So there's this guy, John Hackman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in the year 2000, specifically for calculating that for every dollar that a society invests in helping young mothers to raise their kids, in the long-range society harvests $7 in terms of lack of incarceration, decrease in violence, decrease in medical costs, people getting jobs, people becoming tax-paying citizens, and shit like that. So all of this is being played out against the backdrop of the culture that we choose to live in. And so the culture that we have chosen to live is a military culture, and of course that's how we understand trauma. And when there's an article that appears in the newspaper, it's almost invariably about trauma. Actually, I had the good fortune to get an op-ed published in the New York Times a few years ago. I've written several, but this is the only one that's published, in which I wrote, it's really great that we support the military and make treatment available to them. The treatment happens to be horrendous, but I won't talk about that. But you have to remember that for every soldier that gets traumatized, there's at least 30 kids in our society who are subject to chronic abuse and neglect. And most of the funding that goes into the military is taken away from making it possible for kids to get treatment. So otherwise, there's no problem. That's a good place to start, because there's a background of it. The second piece, I don't know why Mark found it necessary for me to dichotomize me into an empiricist versus an experientialist. Seems like a strange dichotomy to me. Indeed, I love to do science and love to figure out what the underlying issues are, but you start off with clinical practice. And so one of the things that always struck me is the degree to which many traumatized people become identified with their trauma. For example, we used to do an exercise in our experiential workshop, we don't do it anymore, where I would ask people to sit in small groups and tell the rest of the people in the group what they would put on a dating site if they wanted to attract the perfect love of their lives. And about a third of the people said, I'm an incest victim. And I thought, that's an important issue, but I wouldn't lead with that on a dating site. And of course, many people we know who are veterans lead with their Semper Fi decal. If I were a Marine, I'd also have a Semper Fi decal on my truck, be very proud of it. But when that becomes the most important issue in your life, you're in some trouble. Right? And like, I went to some very good schools, but I don't have stickers on those schools in my car, because that's a long time ago. Still grateful about it, still proud of it, but there's a lot of other stuff since that time. And that reminds me of something that, if Mark had given me a thorough introduction, one of the things that I love is to meet dead white guys. I will be one of them before too long. And so I know the history of this field as much as probably just about anybody. And so I read these dead white guys, and I'll show you some of them. And one of my favorite dead white guys is Pierre Janet, who wrote the first great book about trauma in 1889, never translated into English. It's called L'automatisme psychologique. It's about how traumatized people automatically keep replaying their past over and over again. And already he points out many things. I agree with everything he writes about, is that trauma is a physical reaction. Later on, Abraham Gardner calls it a physioneurosis, that the organism keeps reacting to the environment as if the trauma were still actually occurring. Yeah, but it's a physio, it sits in the body, and the body keeps getting reacted. And then in the 1889 book, Genet writes, all traumatized people have the evolution of their lives stopped. They're attached to an unsurmountable obstacle, so they cannot move in. And there's a whole issue about trauma interfering with learning and going on with your life. So that's, so what I really like to do with my life, try to as much as I can, is to take some of these clinical observations and to see what we can do with it to break the power of these issues that have been identified by trauma. And most of them really don't have a lot to do with figuring things out. Let's become very clear about figuring things out. It's great, because now you know why you're fucked up, but knowing why you're fucked up doesn't necessarily make you less fucked up. It just makes you a conscious fucked up human being, which is, for many of that, good enough. But it doesn't change it. It doesn't, we still continue with it. And so, I got very interested in how can we change people's identity. And what became a very powerful issue, and I'll show you in this variety of different ways of approaching that, is through the use of theater. Let's say you are a really scared, traumatized woman, and you play Lady Macbeth, a woman, a queen, who spurs on her husband to do the ultimate evil deed that man can do, namely to kill their masters and their kings. That's bad stuff. And basically, she sexually blackmails him and says, if you don't kill your king, I'll never have sex with you anymore. And the poor guy says, oh my God, I love my king, I love my wife, what do we do? And he hesitates. And then she says, if he had not so resembled my father, I would have done the deed myself. With a bone-chilling little statement. And here you are, this really frightened little person. You have to rise yourself in full head, and you have to say, if he had not so resembled my father. And the director says, your father. Does he know? So we're talking about a program called Shakespeare in the Court in the county where I lived part of the time, Berkshire County, Massachusetts, where if you're a juvenile delinquent, you have a 50% chance that if you steal a car or invade a house, you get condemned to become a Shakespearean actor. I'm very proud to actually live in one of the most civilized parts of America, because that works. And so you see these little girls, and they have to rise them up to self, to full head, have a beautiful dress on, and suddenly they feel big and queenly, and the director says, resembled my father. Does your father know that you were arrested? Does your father know that you are condemned to Shakespeare? Does your father know that you exist? If he had not so resembled my father, I would have done the deed myself. Have you ever thought about killing your father? How would you kill your father? And so as you inhabit that new role that's not you, but somebody else, you get to experience physically what it's like to be somebody other than the creature you have slowly become over time. Another great example is one of the girls we were working with plays the role of Ophelia, terribly sexually abused girl. And so the script now says she drowns herself and Hamlet lifts her up from the pool and carries her out. And she says, but I can't stand anybody touching me because I'm an incest victim. And the director says, well, actually, you're Ophelia and you're dead. And she says, okay, if I'm dead, it's okay if somebody carries me out. And so it's that shifting people out of that habitual position. And actually, much of the task, I think, that we have as therapists is to shift people out. And I'll give you some examples of stuff that I might do to shift people out of their habitual positions, which is not usually cognitive. So, so I took this advanced Shakespearean acting training mainly because I wanted to sound like Darth Vader, because I give so many talks. And for 2 days I talked to Darth Vader, and after 2 days I reverted back to my mumbling, heavily accented Dutch voice. And it was basically failure for me. How we are wired, we are completely interpersonal creatures. It's great that Mark says that I really believe in relationships, it's wonderful. We are relational creatures, we don't exist independent from each other. And so our neurobiology is an interpersonal neurobiology. So this whole notion of DSM, that you're fucked up and it has nothing to do with your environment, is completely anti-biological, it's anti-scientific, doesn't make any sense. And it won't give you, Mark only gave me 4 hours to talk. If you had more time, I would give you my rant on DSM, which is a shameful book. How can you be a member of this profession actually and speak DSM language? It's completely devoid of any scientific validity and any clinical validity. And so what it has done, one of the last political comments I'll make is it has completely corrupted all of us. In that you guys, all of us, no, not me, but all of you, will make your diagnosis not on the basis of what is going wrong with the people you suffer from, what needs to actually be taken care of, but on the basis of what the insurance companies will reimburse you for. Can you get any more corrupt than that? Can you imagine that you would go to a cardiologist with chest pain, and they would give you a diagnosis that would get reimbursed by the insurance companies and not figuring out precisely what's going on with you? So it has made fools out of clinicians, basically, who really no longer make very careful clinical diagnoses. That seems to have disappeared. And so we are a sad set of professions because we are living in la-la land in terms of real careful clinical observations. And that certainly has been an alliance with Mark, in that Mark has also been very much in favor and advocating real, very careful clinical observations, because if you don't carefully define what the issue is, you will likely to give people a wrong and wasteful treatment. So that is really quite important. And it has to do with interpersonal relatedness. And almost every mental disorder has something to do with you not being able to negotiate that interpersonal world. It's not an individual issue. It's about how you relate to other people. And I'll tell you some of the latest data, which are really latest data because they're largely not been published yet, on how those are relevant to our work. So, and so we're supposed to talk about trauma. And most people I know define trauma as something bad that happened to you a long time ago. I think that's fundamentally the wrong definition. And the sooner you get away from that, the better it is. And it's again based on politics, because everything in life is political. So I was part of the group of people who put that original PTSD diagnosis together. And what did we see? We saw a bunch of young guys our age, usually much better looking, much more athletic than we were, who were coming into the clinic, and they were collapsed and frozen, and they had been kick-ass helicopter pilots and all kinds of things, but now they were all slumped over, and their chief complaint was, I have become a monster. Nobody is safe with me. My kids make a little noise and I start screaming and get out of control. I sleep with a new girlfriend and she moves at night and I find myself strangling her because suddenly I think she is trying to attack me. So those were the chief complaints of our traumatized guys, Vietnam soldiers. Now we need to make a diagnosis. Now we cannot say that these guys have become monsters. We needed to make a memory diagnosis. We need to say something happened in Vietnam. Because something happened in Vietnam, these guys are screaming at their kids. And so the opening theme became a criteria, something terrible has happened to you at a particular time, causing intrusive recollections and flashbacks. It's not completely bad, but it's not really what was happening. Because what was really happening is that these guys were behaving right now as if they were in grave danger and if they were being attacked. It was not about memory. And most people actually don't make the connection between what happened back then and what's happening right now. I think CBT is one of the most bizarre treatments. Compare your irrational beliefs with reality. I have tried it. I still do it once a week. I point out to my wife her irrational beliefs. And she always says to me, "Oh, darling, thank you. I was just wandering the desert like a fool. But because you point out the irrationality of my belief, I now know the truth." How did psychologists think so low to believe that that is actually makes sense? Did they ever have teenage children? Point out to the teenage children the error of their ways and meet nothing but gratitude. It is unspeakable. So until your singular lights up. And the other thing is the basal ganglia. What the hell is basal ganglia doing there? Basal ganglia is the part of the brain that makes the muscles move. When you start thinking about playing tennis and lobbying that ball, and we take a brain scan of you, your basal ganglia being activated. And I think, what the hell does the basal ganglia doing? Until we learn more about immobilization, and that the core attitude when you're traumatized is that there is nothing I can do. And now, after we do this, to begin finger wiggling with people, that part of the brain that allows you to actually engage your moving system comes online. That's pretty interesting. So I'm a bit irritated with the majority of my colleagues who say about EMDR, what is new about it is not good, and what's good about it is not new. I go like, no man, this is different. This is not a little exposure treatment, because you actually don't do exposure treatment. This really activates a whole other circuits in the brain, and we better look at that. So it took me about 12 years to steal enough money from other grants to get enough money together to actually do our EMDR study, because NIMH would not fund it, to actually figure out how EMDR works. The long and short of it, it activates 40 megahertz pathways, thalamocortical pathways in the brain. But let me just give you 2 lessons that I learned from EMDR. One of them is that it's crazy. Wiggling your fingers in front of people's eyes, like, that doesn't fit with anything that I was taught in school. So maybe stuff that doesn't make sense to us on the surface works. Maybe our notion that talking and relationship is the only way to salvation may not be true. And so some other people say to me, tapping acupressure points is helpful. I go, okay, empirical question. Turns out to be helpful. And other people, actually it's our work, think maybe putting your butt in the air and standing on one foot might be helpful. Like for PTSD, that doesn't make any sense. And we do this yoga study, incredibly helpful. So maybe stuff that doesn't automatically fit in with your mental scheme might actually be helpful. The other thing is that I live in this world of getting grants and studies, and in that you need to have a statistically significant difference between the control group and the treatment group. So if you can show that your treatment is 10% better than doing nothing, you have an evidence-based treatment. But that's not what we should be looking for. We should be looking for what this lady says. She says, it's over. And the goal of treatment is for people to say, it's over. And so I've really been spending my career on figuring out things that makes people be able to say, it's over. And I'll show you some other examples of that.
And one more to do.
So, my clinic, actually, which is in very serious trouble right now, I'm very worried about its survival, but the clinic has always been devoted to integrating clinical care with research. So we did the first NIH study of EMDR. I had done the first study of Prozac for PTSD ever, so by everybody's standards, I'm a very respectable person because studying drugs is the pinnacle of great research. Ha ha ha. And because I've done that respectable research, I get funded by the NIH to compare EMDR with Prozac with a placebo. And so 100 people come to the study, a third of them get a pill with nothing in it. Dr. van der Kolk's magical PTSD pills, and after 8 weeks of getting a pill with nothing in it, they do get a 44% improvement, which is better than all evidence-based treatments that are being taught in graduate schools to poor, unsuspecting students. So I'm still thinking next time I go to China, I'm going to have them package pills with sugar in it, label it, evidence-based, so it should be approved by the FDA for pills 3 times a day, $10 a pill for the rest of your life, and it will assure my retirement, because it's evidence-based. And then Prozac does slightly better. Here you need to know something about the politics of science again, and that is that in order, if you have a very small difference, you can make it statistically significantly different if you have a large enough sample. It has something to do with statistical power. So if this had been a sample of 600 people, that small difference would have been significant. Who has the money to make very small differences significant? The drug companies. And now CBT also gets a large amount of money from NIH. Nobody else can possibly compete with that. So if you do a study, your treatment has to be really, really effective because none of us has enough money to do gigantic studies. This is EMDR. EMDR is a very nice drop for PTSD. And after 8 weeks, we tell these people, haha, we fooled you, you gave nothing, and we said you can either get EMDR or Prozac because we cannot leave you untreated. So someone will get nothing, whatever. We tell these people goodbye, do whatever you need to do. We'll see you 2 months from now for a follow-up. You tell these people goodbye, see you 2 months later for a follow-up. And so 2 months later, we interview these people. The Prozac people have regressed a little bit, not as much as I expected. The EMDR people have gotten better. Another 6 months later, so it's an 8-month follow-up, the Prozac people have continued to decline, and the EMDR people continue to improve. Which is an interesting thing. And it reminds me of what Milton Erickson said, once you kick the log, the stuffed river will keep flowing. And so once you open up that it's safe to access these things, it seems to continue. And then we start studying how it works. It's another story. But I'm interested not in whether people improve, I'm interested in whether people are cured. And it turns out that after 8 weeks of treatment, 1 out of 5 EMDR people say, it's gone, it's all over. 1 out of 8 Prozac people. 2 months later, by now, 28% of the EMDR people say, yeah, it's gone. I don't get triggered anymore, I don't get upset, I don't freak out, I'm sleeping okay. None of the Prozac people. Another 6 months later, 60% of the EMDR people say, hey, I haven't felt anything, it doesn't bother me anymore. My kids scream and I go, hey, can you be quiet? I don't blow up anymore. People touch me, and if I like their touch, I welcome their touch, stuff like that. Down to the Prozac. So this is the best treatment outcome of any method that has been done. It is even better than the next treatment I'm going to tell you about, which I'm very much into these days, which is also very interesting. But then there's always been this issue which has always been on our minds, and Mark and I very much allied ourselves around it, is that adult onset trauma is very different from chronic child abuse and neglect. And we all call it PTSD, and I've been fighting like crazy to stop that. And we continue to grossly label everybody with the same label. It's a terrible mistake, because these things need a completely different treatment. And so, as luck would have it, exactly half of our patients were adults who were assaulted, raped, tortured in Chile and South Africa, and those people did exceptionally well. We have about an 80% cure rate with the EMDR. So if I meet a person with a good premorbid history who has a one-time trauma, I can say with great confidence, we have an 80% chance that you'll be out of here and it will all be gone. We tested this, for example, after the Boston Marathon bombing. People had seen this explosion of people being blown up. So, to my mind, EMDR is one of the essential tools of being a trauma therapist, because it's so helpful, it works so well, it works so fast, and it gets people better. But the big population, of course, is this population, and that is people with early childhood trauma who are now grown up, and we target their trauma with EMDR. Our results aren't bad. 30% cure rate is still an astounding rate, but 70% of the people didn't get cured, and some of the people got worse. So EMDR is a tool that is sometimes helpful with childhood trauma, but you need much more than that. So it's also interesting, so I write my book, I write a very laudatory, encouraging chapter about EMDR. I get more crap about that EMDR chapter than any other chapter in the book from the EMDR community. And they say, you say that it doesn't really cure childhood trauma, and that's not true, and blah, blah. And I go like, hey guys, this is not about religion. And and therapists, I see it all the time. They're such religious people. Once they learn something, they're more loyal to their religion than making sure that their patients get better for it. It's pervasive. I see it in psychoanalysis. I see it in the work of my very dear friend, Dick Schwartz, who does IFS, which I adore and love and do all the time. And people say, I'm an EMDR therapist, I'm a psychoanalyst, I said, no, I know a particular method that helps some people. Our allegiance is to the work, not to religion. Okay, so this is the big challenge. Very complex, and because it doesn't exist, it's very hard to study it. As long as it's not in any diagnostic network. So what's interesting and disgusting is that the vast majority of the people we treat, we don't have the capacity to study what works for them best, because they don't fit into the existing schemes of the world. That's that. I'm going to skip this one, because we'll get it back to politics and we don't do that. So, EMDR, very helpful for specific traumatic memories. If somebody sits in my office and they freeze up and they start getting really uptight, I say, shall we use some EMDR on that? It usually comes down to specific memories. The next thing is that about 15 or 20 years ago, two guys say, would you like to go for dinner? The names are Vic Doblin and Michael Mithofer. And we have dinner together, and they say, we are really interested in studying psychedelic substances for the treatment of PTSD. And I think that is so cool. Not only am I a child of the 60s myself, but I also happen to have worked for a guy, Professor Bastiaans in the Netherlands, who treated Holocaust survivors with LSD, who claimed to have very good results, but was never written up very well. And I also had to occupy Timothy Leary's office at Harvard at some point, and I'm very familiar with how much promise psychedelic agents had, and also how it completely kicked the dust. And I actually have a quote somewhere that I need to put in my slides by John Ehrlichman, who says, let's associate blacks with heroin and hippies with cocaine and LSD, and then we will make these drugs illegal, and that way we can punish our enemies by the drugs that they're associated with. Very interesting. And so I saw, as many of you did also, that these drugs that used to be being used, for better or for worse, suddenly become criminalized and people go to jail and all research in this stopped. And so Michael and Rick and I talk about it, and I say, you guys are crazy for trying to revise this. You'll never get it done because there is so much opposition out there. And they say, thank you for your opinion. We're going to do it. And they did it. And they did. They now have done phase 1 and phase 2 studies on MDMA. And now phase 3, which is the last study, are being done. I'm the principal investigator of the Boston study. And it is on a fast track to become legalized in the year 2021. So one is the issue of mindfulness. Of course, everybody's thinking mindfulness these days, how important mindfulness is, and it's a buzzword in a way, and how helpful mindfulness is. But the best neuroscientist in the area of mindfulness is a German woman by the name of Tanja Singer, who did a very extensive study, multi-people, multi-site study on mindfulness. And what she finds out is that mindfulness is only useful when it's accompanied by self-compassion. You can be as mindful as you can, but if there's no inner light for what's going on inside of you, it doesn't work. And I've been struck very much in my own practice that I've seen a number of people who were clearly unwanted children, whose parents tried to abort them when they were little, that continued to go on. They also had trauma, but most of all, a deep sense of defectiveness, because when a child is unloved, a child always thinks, I'm not being loved because I'm a fundamentally unlovable person. And all of my early child molestation patients, they always have a deep Piagetian sense, which is sort of predictive of how a child thinks at that time, that this is happening to me because I'm a bad person. And there's no way that a child can create a notion, oh, they're really messed up and I'm just fine, as they're being messed. So it becomes part of your identity, part of yourself. And I've worked with a number of people the past few years who, you all meet people like that from time to time when you come to your office. I just adore them. And I think to myself, boy, I wish you were my patient. I wish I could be your friend, because I just think you're the most wonderful person in the world. And what they live with is a deep self-hatred and this pervasive sense of I'm not good enough, that all their life experiences and all their good deeds and all their wonderful therapists has been unable to take away. And that is part of why I was so eager to do the MDMA research, because I wanted to see if with people like that, the MDMA can create enough self-compassion so they can really feel like, oh my God, I was this wonderful child and I did not deserve this. An extremely hard thing to get into people. So that's item number one. Item number two is what you see so beautifully played out in this tape, and that's the issue of parts. And Dick Schwartz told me yesterday he's going to come here and talk to you guys. When is he going to come talk?
Wednesday.
What?
Next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday. So, how many people here do IFS? So a number of you. So, once you know IFS, I mean, to my mind, IFS is one of these. I think EMDR is one of the cornerstones. I think IFS is one of the cornerstones. To know how people live their lives in parts, and that what you see is not what you get, and that once you get traumatized, you build up managers and protectors to make sure you never get hurt again, and these managers and protectors sort of keep the pain at bay and when the pain no longer can be controlled, these firefighters come in, they start to drink and take drugs to make the feelings go away, all in the service of protecting that core, vulnerable, hurt part of oneself. And it's a great model, and very much sort of for more or less how I also do my psychotherapy. Interesting, Michael Mithofer was trained in IFS, but what you see all the time is that in these MDMA sessions, the parts come up, and the parts start communicating with each other. I have one major issue with Dick that we have debated in public also. Dick says, I can get anybody in self to observe all these parts. And I go like, that's great. You must be an exceptionally talented therapist. I am not. I'm just sort of a more ordinary guy. And there's a lot of people I know who I cannot get into self. Actually, I don't believe they can either. But can all of you get everybody into self who comes in the office? No. And once you see how really messed up their brains are, which I'll talk about, you go like all these pieces that have to do with me and self, they're just not there. And so you're just this preparation of fear, terror, and whatever. And to get people there is very difficult. So what I hope we can demonstrate is that MDMA can help to solidify that sense of observing self that makes this work more possible. My own experience that I had 2 weeks as part of my being the principal investigator was somewhat different. I have a friend who used to be the Commissioner for Child's Protection for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a guy I greatly love and admire. And he went down to Bolivia and took ayahuasca. And when he came back, he said, I had the most unbelievable experience. All of the traumatized children in the world who ever lived came to visit me. And the women in the village held me for a whole week. And he says, at the end, I was glad I had the experience. And I said, boy, I'm glad I did not have that experience, because there's no way in hell I think I could have survived that. As luck would have it, when I had my MDMA experience, I experienced a little bit similar to that. There's a videotape of it that I haven't seen, I probably won't look at it either. But what I said repeatedly is, this is a party drug? Oh my God, this is a party drug? There's nothing partying about it. And so for 3 or 4 hours, they helped me, as I think I felt all the pain that has been unloaded on me on all the years of my practice, and it was pretty bad. At the same time, what is very intriguing to me is that, I always think about what happens in the brain. At every moment during this very painful experience, I was aware that I was in the middle of an experience, and it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that makes all the difference in the world. I'll get back to that whole timekeeping system of the brain, which is so important. So I always knew that, so this is happening, I'm feeling this, but then something else is going to happen, and then something else is going to happen. And that is the difference between trauma and having a bad experience. Because when you're traumatized, you think this will last forever. Just imagine, you're sitting here, and it looks, most of you look not so unhappy that you came here today, you're intrigued with what's going on. If suddenly Mark would announce, we have actually contracted with Bessel to be here forever. We will talk to you about the brain and this accident, and and we have fitted him with a little catheter so he doesn't have to go to the bathroom, and he may take a little bite from a sandwich, and you just guys have to sit here till Wednesday morning. This whole experience would turn into a hellhole. And so the issue that something comes to an end is our main sense of comfort. And that's the issue with trauma, is that when you're traumatized, you feel like this will last forever. And this will, you pay this in some other tapes also to deal with this particular dimension. So it's interesting that I had this experience very unexpected. And afterwards, I felt very soft. I felt very gentle. I felt very connected with the people I was with. But it also was not a fun experience. And actually, treating trauma is not about fun. This guy didn't have a fun experience reliving himself either. It is actually what I think, and we hope to really document this, is what MDMA may facilitate is that people can go to places where they were too scared and too upset to go before. Because in a way, trauma is all about not being able to tolerate what you feel and not able to tolerate what you know. And maybe the treatment of trauma is to create a condition in which people can feel what they feel and say, yes, that was awful, but it really happened 40 years ago, or it happened 30 years ago. And so the whole issue of treating trauma, we'll get back to that when I talk more about the brain, is about being able to tolerate having the feelings and to be able to know where it fits in with the course of your life. And to know that today being in Monterey is not the same as what happened 2 weeks ago in Boston or what happened 50 years ago in the Netherlands. So that these are all experiences and you know yourself in this sausage of time. So the issue of time is a very, very critical dimension that is really worth talking more about. So he says here, so I wonder if this will last. And so the big issue of doing studies is indeed for whom does it work, for whom it doesn't work. They have done studies at this point of 72 different people. The CAP score drops significantly. Interesting, much to my surprise, not as much is in our adult onset EMDR study. But profound changes that seem to last for 72 months over time. So it's very long-term follow-up. So the big question is, for me, is this stuff never works for everybody. One size never fits all. And so I'm very curious for whom it will work, for whom it doesn't work, who responds best, who responds least well, and so the complexity of this treatment. So I'm very excited to be part of this study. There's also one being done in LA, one in San Francisco, so we're all talking to each other. Next, I'm going to talk about the brain. The preamble is that we look at the world through the technology that's available to us. And so I heard some people talk about chemicals already, and that is basically because when I started my training, we didn't know anything about chemicals in the brain, and then as I'm just starting in my freshman year in college, somebody learns to measure norepinephrine in the brain. And about the same time, some drug companies are developing some drugs that seem to affect norepinephrine and dopamine, and it starts making people a lot of money. And so because we now are beginning to move into a chemical world, we understand the world through chemistry. And every piece of research that's being done is a chemical research about dopamine and schizophrenia, serotonin and depression, all this sort of stuff. And for 20 years, that's all we studied. And at the end, we hardly found anything. But that chemical model of the brain still persists. Like yesterday I had a conference about MDMA, and somebody's just giving these bullshit explanation how MDMA works on these different chemical systems. That doesn't explain anything, but he's sort of still locked in that chemical view of the world. And then, we all are affected by it. We all have cell phones, and our world is completely different before we had cell phones. I talked to everybody I wanted to talk to today already because I texted and stuff. We couldn't have done that 15 years ago. So our worlds have totally changed. And if you would ask me, so what does your friend so-and-so thinks about it, I'll say, well, let me see what he has to say. And they will text to my friend in Australia, and 5 minutes later we know what the answer will be like. Inconceivable. And so technology determines what we can see, And about 25 years ago, we started to be able to take pictures of the brain. And as luck would have it, I happened to be at Harvard, my clinic house right next to the laboratory where they have their first neuroimaging study, and we actually did the first neuroimaging study of PTSD. Sheer luck. So much of life is luck. And so we get to know about the brain and understand what happens in the brain, and now dance therapists will say, can you take a picture of the brain, how dance therapy changes the brain? And I go, like, why don't you just show what dance therapy does? You don't need the brain scan, but that sort of becomes the standard of the field. And certainly for psychotherapists, I think doing brain image is very difficult because we don't know where the symbolic processes by which we live are located in the brain. And so we've done, all the money went into neuroimaging for a while, and then about 5 years ago we learned how to measure DNA and the genome, and now everybody is studying it. They call that genome, and that's where all the money is going, and everybody explaining the world through the genome. Just another way of showing how the whole organism gets messed up by trauma. And so take all these things with a grain of salt. They just are boys playing with toys. Boys just love to play with toys. And so we learn something from these things, and we don't learn other things from these things. We have learned something about the brain, actually quite a bit, and that continues to evolve. But what strikes me most about the brain is that everybody's talking about the brain, and the psychotherapists continue to work in notions that are completely contradictory or orthogonal to how the brain works. So let me just start with this. So here's our brain, and all of you, some of you may be bored seeing this picture like this again. And when you introduce yourself to me and say, hi, my name is Kimberly or something, I think to myself, oh, so the name of this little sliver over here is called Kimberly, and can tell me what she likes, what she doesn't like, where she has been, what her opinions are. It's a marvelous part of the brain, and if you take that part of the brain, she becomes a very dull and uninteresting person, but it's a tiny sliver of the brain. And actually, that's not where trauma sits. And I think it's really disturbing how, to the degree to which psychotherapists have not really integrated it. That is not where the problem is. It's not because you're stupid or that you haven't gotten the right insight that this stuff happens, because trauma really hits you over here. It hits you in the housekeeping of your body over here. It hits you into the alarm system of your brain over here. It hits you in your sense of self that's located over here and some other area. So it sits in that unconscious part of the brain. And so the big question is, how do we get there? So let's open up the brain a little bit more and break it up into roughly 3 pieces. So this is the part of the world, the brain that you come into the world with. That is what little babies, newborn babies have. So what can little newborn babies do? They can sleep and be awake, they can pee and poop, they can breathe, they can suck, they can cry. I think that's about it, right? And we are programmed to find them cute, and that's why they live. And so that's all they do. And so when we take psychiatric histories, we don't talk about people's breathing patterns or eating patterns or pooping habits, because that is sort of an embarrassing, primitive, irrelevant part of the brain. But that's where trauma hits. Trauma hits in your sleep cycles, how you stay awake. It hits you in your appetite. It hits you in the way you breathe. It hits you in the core housekeeping of your body. And so maybe that is where we should start, to just take care of that core housekeeping. It's in these core issues. And so we get into yoga, because it seems to be part of the brain that really activates and helps to manage that part of the brain. And then people in our clinic say, so when do you think my patient is ready to start doing yoga? And I say, that may not be the right question to ask. Maybe the right question to ask, when is my patient ready to do psychotherapy? Because as long as the basement is flooded and the mind isn't working but is completely all over the place, do we still not have first to regulate that core system in the brain so that the basics of the brain are taken care of, and then we can bring the higher cognitive functions of the brain alive. And I'll get back to that in a very serious way, because I think that's a very serious question. And so that's one thing that I'm paying attention to, and I'll show you one set of data and videotapes on that in the next hour and 20 minutes that we have. And then so that where you start. And then the second part of your brain, again, how many people in this room have raised children or are raising children? So the vast majority. I said, to my mind, go have children, because they will teach you a lot of stuff. And having children also exposes you to kindergarten teachers. And to my mind, kindergarten teachers know more about how to regulate limbic system that's regulated kids than any of us. And we should all become students of kindergarten teachers, how to deal with these regulated little things that have very little frontal lobe. And so when you raise kids, what you see is your kid becomes, your kid starts off as a piece of instinct, it wakes up in the middle of the night and cries whenever it wants to, and then slowly that kid becomes more and more social. And because that brain is a social brain. And you're happy when your kid becomes more and more regulated and more in tune with his social environment, and you say, I'm a real cool kid, and if your kid continues to be out of sync with everybody else, you go and slap on these stupid DSM diagnoses on them, all of which have no scientific validity whatsoever. And certainly one way in which you can really interfere with that brain coming online is by hitting your kid all the time, ignoring your kid all the time, abusing your kid all the time. That will really mess up all this part of your brain. And so basically what that middle part of your brain is all about is so your kid wandering about, seeing what's happening. What your kid is doing is, what effect do I have on the world around me? What effect has the world around me on me? And that kid is creating a map of the world that becomes an internal map, an internal GPS, is what makes me feel good, what makes me feel bad, what gives me a sense of pleasure, what gives me a sense of excitement, pain. And that's the core sense of yourself, of who you are in relationship to your surroundings, completely non-cognitive. It's a completely experiential sense of yourself. Very important, because if you're like the two grandchildren that are in my life right now, you have the experience of continuously having people oohing and eyeing about what an amazing kid you are. And the moment you do anything, people go, you can see that, oh my God, let's take a picture of that. And so this kid gets surrounded by completely exaggerated estimations of how amazing he is. And no kid is going to say, when somebody says, oh my God, you're the most amazing kid in the world, say, well, Mom and Dad, I've actually been looking over pictures of kids around the world, all around the world, and you always tell me I'm so cute, but actually I think I'm slightly to the left of the bell-shaped curve, and there's about 4 billion of us, or 1 billion, and I think I'm probably sort of average in terms of my accomplishment. No, and when people come and adore you all the time, you get a map of the world is that I'm fundamentally an adorable person. Very helpful to have that map in the world, because later on people will put you down and betray you and fire you from your jobs. And for a moment you feel bad, but the deep sense of I'm an adorable person will come back, and you go like, hey, fuck you, I'm an adorable person. But if, an example I'd like to give is if you have your 4th birthday, there's no party, your mom is lying in front of the air conditioner or the stove, drunk, and says, look what you have done to me, we were a happy family, and your dad took one look at you and said, I'm out of here, and he moved to Alaska someplace, we have never seen him again, and I was on my way to become a Metropolitan Opera star, and instead I've become a hopeless drunk because you are a terrible child. These are the sort of things that people say to children, and that people say to children all the time, the people who I treat. And no kid ever says, you're full of shit. And so it always becomes part of you. But it's impressive to me, and somebody should study that, because right now it's just a kind of impression, is that the age at which you know this is about you and not about me, to a large degree determines how well you do in your life when you live with abusive and hurtful caregivers. And so I know some people who at age 8 figured out, man, I made the wrong choice when I chose my parents. Like a few more years, but I'll just hold on to myself and get the hell out of here. And other people I know who are 55 years old who are still trying to change themselves to get blood out of a stone. And so this issue of accommodating to abusive environments is part of our system and is very much at the core. And so this is what, to my mind, is an issue for, I would say, the majority of people who come to see me, who continues to feel that I'm defective, I'm bad, I'm an awful person. Then I have two anecdotes that really helped me a lot. One of them is I was running a group for incest victims. And there's a woman in the group, like many of them, but she was the most extreme, who always blamed herself. She said, oh, he did this to me because I loved him too much. I was just the wrong child. I didn't resist him, it was my fault, I'm terrible. She'd always take responsibility for anything bad that happened in the world because she didn't do enough. And I would say, whenever she do that, I'd say, Kathy, you know, it really wasn't your fault. You loved your dad, you're supposed to love your dad, and it was his obligation to set boundaries. And she would say, oh, thank you, that's very helpful. And so that came up over and over again. And about a year and a half into the group, one of these incidents, I say, again, it wasn't your fault. And then Kathy says to me, you know, Bessel, you know, we are like monkeys in the zoo. You observe us and you diagnose us, and we observe you and diagnose you. And so I have noticed how terribly invested you are in being seen as a really great therapist. And in fact, I would say that you're really quite narcissistically vulnerable and fragile in that regard. And so whenever you make these stupid-ass comments, I go like, oh, thank you very much, because, you know, I'm an incest victim. I was raised to take care of narcissistically vulnerable guys. But now that I've been in a group for a year and a half about, I think I should really tell you that, you know, these comments are for you and not for me. And basically what you communicate to me is that you cannot tolerate how helpless you feel about the fact that you don't know anything about how to change my self-blaming attitudes. And so you give me this superficial bullshit stuff in order to cover up the fact of how inept you are. And I said, that's very helpful. I remember that. And so I have a rule in my practice that whenever I say, you shouldn't feel that way, I don't charge for that session. And I would encourage you to do the same thing, because it's about us. And, you know, if we look at it honestly, we know that a lot of comments that we make are for us to show how smart we are, whatever. But a lot of self-serving stuff happens. Maybe not yours, but never mind. And then I'm beginning to see the potential of an answer in the same group. A few months later, these are old stories, another member of the group who is a PhD psychologist who runs a group home for sexually abused girls who, miracle, had been sexually abused herself, and she's in the group, and she was referred to me by a former supervisor who didn't like me because she was so aggressive. And so she comes to my group, very aggressive woman. I like her, she's feisty, she's smart, but a little bit hard to take sometimes. And one day she comes back into the group and she says, I had an amazing experience this weekend. I went to get trained in EMDR. And this before I joined that bandwagon. And so I roll my eyes and I think, oh my God, another cult follower. And she says, can I talk about what happened to me? And the group, of course, eager to hear what she has to say. And she says, you know, when I went through my EMDR session, I watched myself as a 7-year-old getting molested by my dad. And I saw how I was this scrawny, 40-pound, 30-pound little thing, and this huge, blubbery, white, hairy guy lying on top of her, trying to ram himself into this girl. That's disgusting. How can a guy do that to a little girl? And so what EMDR made possible is the same thing that you try to do in IFS, the same thing that you try to do with MDMA, the same thing you try to do with hypnosis, because there's many pathways to this, and it's up to us to find out which is the pathway for any particular person, is to unblend yourself from that kid to whom this happened, and to go and observe what happened to this kid from a mature point of view, and to see really what that kid was up against back then. And once you see the difference between you, who oftentimes still feels like this kid, and but who that kid really was, you begin to get the perspective of, oh, now I know what this poor kid had to go through. But as long as you're identified with this kid and said, I'm an incest victim, and confuse yourself with a 7-year-old who was really a completely different person than you are now, then you have nowhere to go. And so that unblending becomes a critical issue. And so the question is, what tools do each one of us have in our toolbox to get people in a position of being the people they are right now, and being able to visit viscerally, emotionally, visually the person who they were back then. And that, I think, can reset this system, this map of your brain, of who you really are. So on top of that comes then your prefrontal cortex. That is terribly important also, and I'll talk about some of the details, because many parts of that cortex also go wrong with the results that we see in our offices, having to do with planning, anticipation, sense of time, contact inhibition, appropriate actions, and empathic understanding. So here's an example of what happens in the prefrontal cortex. So when you come into the world, you are just a little limbic creature. And then slowly, different parts of your brain come online. And to my mind, two of the critical parts really worth for us to think about is this first part, the earliest part of the prefrontal cortex, is the orbital prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that tells you to not do something. It starts off with when you discover how much fun it is to bite your mother's nipple. I never had a chance to check it out with my mom, but I'm sure I was one of these kids. And I can totally get it. Like, you bite, and here you're tiny, and people start screaming and hollering, and this big thing starts moving around, and you go like, oh my God, I'm only 2 months old, and look what I can do. I totally get how much pleasure about me. And so you do it, and people scream, and all this sort of stuff. And then at some point, you get an orbital prefrontal cortex, and it says, the orbital prefrontal cortex says to you, yeah, it really feels good to bite and have all this commotion, but have you noticed that the nipple gets pulled out of your mouth, and you no longer get hugged, and you no longer get food, and you have to make a choice between the pleasure of biting versus the pleasure of being hugged and getting fed. And your orbital prefrontal cortex says, no, I'd rather get food and get hugs. And so part of your brain says, don't bite anymore. So the orbital prefrontal cortex turns out to be a part of the brain that gets very damaged by early childhood trauma. And it tells you, no, I shouldn't do this. Which is interesting, because that's the part of your brain that inhibits you from impulses. My poster child for that is this guy who tweets every morning at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
Like, and I have a friend who, journalist, who writes to me at some point, I grew up next to that family, and my mother really knew Mary Trump. So I give him a profile of the sort of mother who would create a kid who tweets at 3 o'clock in the morning. He said, how did you know? I said, I see kids like this all the time who cannot inhibit their impulses. Like, this is the poster child for a person who has been severely damaged early on in life by the lack of loving input. I mean, that's how you get there. You can also put stakes for your brain, that's another way of getting it, but you become that way in a particular way. It doesn't just happen by accident. So what's also interesting here is, again, it's a big public health thing because, you guys spent millions and millions of dollars on treating juvenile delinquents in California. And most of your programs are finger-wagging programs. They say, like, if you do this, terrible things will happen to you. Very helpful for anybody who has an orbital prefrontal cortex. Completely useless if you don't have one. Because the orbital prefrontal cortex is the finger-wagging part of your brain. And so if you don't have that part of your brain, finger-wagging won't make any difference, as we have seen also, for example, in the White House. And so when you work with these kids, you need to do something that actually works, that actually gets that part of the brain online. And what is very helpful for me in beginning to think about it is that I was an advisor to the Truth Commission in South Africa. I don't think I ever contributed anything to it, but boy, was it fascinating to see the process. Most interesting thing I've seen my whole life, actually. It was astounding trauma therapy. I won't go into details, but the one detail is that because of that, I had the chance to be at a reception with Nelson Mandela. And the conversation goes something like this, like, you used to be the head of the terrorist army. Mandela was put in jail not because he was a nice guy. He was bombing gas stations and police stations, stuff like that. And if you're a white supremacist, you go like, hey, we better get this guy and put him in jail. So it's not, he wasn't innocent. You might not join him in it, but he was put in jail for good reason. And so he come out like this super saintly person. What do you think happened to you? And he says, I thought a lot about it. I think what did it was boxing. And I go, that doesn't quite make sense to me. He says, when you box, you probably don't do it yourself. You need to know exactly where the other person is, and you need to anticipate where this person is going to hit you. You need to duck, and as you're ducking, you need to already plan your next blow. And I say, that makes perfect sense, because these circuits are exactly the circuits that get interrupted by trauma, where you just let things happen to you, and you don't anticipate it, you don't take the protective action anymore. And so maybe martial arts just might be the best treatment for traumatized individuals, at least to get some of these brain things back online. I've had some difficulty getting funders to agree to that, but it's obvious. It's also interesting in how many really scary, dangerous, traumatized places, like a visiting professor at Bahia in Brazil 2 years ago. And all these traumatized kids are doing capoeira, a Japanese form of boxing. There may be good reason why they're doing that. Maybe that really helps them to reorganize this impaired circuits of their brain. And the other part here of the brain that's really important in trauma is this area over here. It's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And they talked about this when they talked about timekeeping earlier on. That's the part of your brain that does timekeeping. And so, let me ask, how many people in this room have heard me say things that you thought, on Monday or Tuesday during my practice, I'll try this out? Anybody who's done that? One person, 2 people, 3 people, 4 or 5, 5, 6. So some of you can be certified as having dorsolateral prefrontal cortices. And so what does the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does? It takes what's come into your brain, compares with what you know already, and use what comes in to plan for the future. So part of the brain gets really messed up when you're traumatized. And so everybody in this room who treats a lot of trauma must have been frustrated by the fact that so many of your patients don't seem to learn from experience. Same damn thing over and over again. There is something in the learning process that isn't working. And that has something to do with this particular part of the brain and some other things that I will hopefully cover before the afternoon is over. And so, as luck would have it, I was part of the first team that did the neuroimaging study of trauma. And as a result of that, so Harvard gets this laboratory, a few studies have been done, and the guy who runs the lab says, Bessel, I've been sort of reading your stuff and I know you. Do you think you'd get 8 people or a bunch of people to volunteer to have a flashback in a scanner? Because you'd like to see what happens in the brain. And I say, boy, it would be fantastic if we do that. So I ask 8 people, would you like to have a flashback in the scanner where you feel exactly the way that you felt when you were raped, or your kid was run over by a drunk driver, or when you were assaulted, something like that. And I ask 8 people, and all 8 people say, and they say, what does it entail? I say, well, you come to the lab, take your clothes off, put hospital Johnny, we tie you down on a stretcher, we put you into this machine, we put your head into a vice, so you cannot move your head, so we can get precise pictures of the brain that is not moving, and then we'll give you a script that will induce you to have a flashback while you breathe radioactive oxygen. Would you like to do that? And 8 out of 8 people said, absolutely. Nobody said no. It tells you something about the dubious nature of informed consent. And so I asked, 2 of them became my patients later on, and I asked them both, so why did you volunteer for this study? Like, you must have known much better how deeply upsetting this would be for you. So why'd you do it anyway? And they said, you know, I felt so crazy. And I was hoping that your study would give some sense of why I feel as crazy as I do. And I said, yes, it did. Unfortunately, very few people actually are taking this study, which now has been replicated numerous times, very seriously. So the first challenge we had was to induce a flashback into people. And we learned from some earlier people, the way to do that is you focus on the specific sensory elements of the trauma. So as long as you stay in your abstract brain, if somebody talks about domestic violence, you talk about how terrible men are and how terrible the laws are, and how women aren't being protected and women are being oppressed, you stay in a safe part of the brain and you can talk about it forever. But if you start talking about what did his face look like before he hit you, and where did he hit you, and even more, what did you say before he hit you, because it turns out that in domestic violence disputes, it's initiated by women about 2/3 of the time by violent behavior, violent actions, and that men then hit in response to it, and that men do much more damage than women do, but women turn out to be not really nicer people than men are, although my feminist colleagues always try to convince me otherwise. The data don't support that. And so when you talk about the specifics of the assault, who said what, where were you, what did you look like, what did you feel in your body, then people go back there. So the trauma is we experience in episodic memory, the specific details. So since we want to have a flashback, we go back to the specific details of the trauma. Boy, are we running out of time? I'm really increasingly wonder what I'm going to talk about because. So here's an example of a script we make. This is a script of a woman who's picked up her daughter after school, sits in the front seat. The seatbelt isn't working properly, it's beeping. Her daughter says, hey mom, my seatbelt isn't working. And mom says, don't worry about it, I'll fix it for you. She leans over to fasten her daughter's seatbelt. As she does so, she goes through a red light. Her car plows into them, kills her daughter. That's the sort of work we do. That's trauma that I see. And when people ask me, oh, why are some people more vulnerable to trauma than others? My response is almost always, actually, that's not a question I ever ask myself. Because basically every story I ever hear in my office, my reaction is like, how come you came out as well as you did? Like after what you have experienced, my God, I could not have functioned as well as you did. I can't even begin to imagine how I would have tolerated what happened to you. So I'm not really a big fan of, oh, it's only weak people who get trauma. No. These stories are horrendous. So we take this picture. So this is a composite scan of 8 people. Cross-section of the brain, front of the brain, back of the brain, right of the brain, left of the brain. And so what we see is the imprint of the trauma is on the right side of the brain. It's on the emotional feeling part of the brain. And I could talk about it a lot, but basically being traumatized means that you're filled with feeling. It's all about your emotional world. It's nothing to do with cognitive world. There's nothing happens on the left side. It's not because you're not thinking properly or you haven't figured it out. It's all because your emotional brain keeps sending you messages. I'm in danger, I'm going to die, terrible things are going to happen. It's all purely a state that one is in. And particularly, and for me this was the most important part of the study that then determined the rest of my particular career, is the part of the brain that goes most offline is this area over here, Broca's area, Brodmann area 47. It's the speech center of the brain. And so we have 2 speech centers of the brain. One of them is Broca's area that I use right now to explain stuff to you, and the other one is Wernicke's area that allows you to say fuck, shit, and piss. And Wernicke's area stays online when you're being traumatized, so you can still yell at people, but any sort of articulate speech disappears. Again, showing that somehow Shakespeare knew everything, because when you see a Shakespeare play and something really terrible happens, Shakespeare said, and they got dumbfounded, or they got struck with speechless terror. Psychiatrists never figured that one out, but Shakespeare was much smarter than anyone else. And so trauma is about speechless terror, and there is no language. And of course this was a very big thing. When they saw this, they said, like, maybe we need to find treatments that may sometimes bypass language. And so the left hemisphere goes offline, being able to tell stories, problem solving, telling creativity, not knowing what's going on if it goes down. And this is the right brain, and the right brain is all about emotions, all about feeling. So when you're traumatized, you have lots of feelings. So I'm trying to think about what I'm going to show you in a short time. So then my old students, Paul Fruin and Ruth Daniels, who to my mind now are the foremost neuroscientists in the world of trauma, actually. Last time I talked to Ruth, I said to her, I think you will get the Nobel Prize. I really think they have a good chance. They are doing astonishing work. So I'll show you just a few little pieces. So we have an area in our brain called the periaqueductal gray. I call that the cockroach center of our brain. It's the most, I mean, it's like right above your brainstem. Everything that is alive has that little part of your brain. The most primitive signal of you're in danger. And so Ruth and her colleagues put a whole bunch of people in the scanner, and what they find is that if you're not traumatized, that part of your brain doesn't light up. When you're traumatized, that part of your brain is active all the time. There's a subtle message of you're in danger, you're in danger, you're in danger, danger. And then she shows that where precisely that activation is, that's a few millimeters apart, has an impact on how it gets expressed on a higher level. But the engine of it all is deep down. So I could talk about it for a long time, but so the most challenging thing in treating trauma is how to help people feel completely and viscerally safe. And that's where the body comes in. That's probably where body therapy comes in, because touch is probably our most elementary way of making ourselves feel safe. And as long as you cannot tolerate the touch of other human beings, it's very unlikely that you can ever feel viscerally safe. And that eventually is one of the things that got us both into yoga and into neurofeedback. And what we discovered that even in yoga, that part of the brain keeps firing. Now, the next thing is interesting also. always impressed when I show this to therapists, they seem very unexcited about this. I don't quite understand this. But so, my friends in Bessel University acquired this three-dimensional little mannequin for $30,000 imported from Germany. And you can alternatively call him a dark, handsome stranger or a creepy guy, depending on your thing. So now you lie in a scanner, and they put 30 people in the scanner, and this creepy guy or handsome guy comes by, and his frontal lobe lights up and goes like, oh my God, I wonder if he likes the dress I'm wearing. I wonder if he likes my marinara sauce. I wonder if he plays tennis or golf. And so when you see some dark handsome person, the possibilities of what you could do together to have fun start playing in your imagination. A wonderful thing to have. And then they play the same guy to 30 severely traumatized adults, and that lights up. Very aqueduct of the brain, the fear center of the brain. And I love to show this to therapists because we all, I think, on some level, think that we are wonderful people, and that you have been exposed to terrible things, and I'm really sorry for you. And if you come into treatment with me, you'll be exposed to a really nice, compassionate, warm, understanding person. And before too long, you will take all my goodness inside of you, and you'll feel what it feels like to be deeply understood and felt by other people. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe people will experience your wonderfulness as one of the scariest things they can ever experience. We are not, by definition, safe. If your map of the world sees people as being dangerous, you can see the Dalai Lama as being dangerous. If your map of the world is all messed up, you can see Donald Trump as a safe man. Yes. Stuff like that. And so your whole sense of safety and danger becomes messed up. And then what we observe is that trauma is not all about being activated by danger. It's also shutting down in the face of danger. And in fact, what people notice, because it's so obvious, is that when people get agitated by danger, you can see how frightened, upset, and aggressive people are. But the more common response, probably, certainly over time, is that people shut down and shut themselves out and don't feel anything. And that's sort of the end of having a life if you no longer respond. And so we start figuring out what these different parts of the brain are, more than we. So this is the first scan of people who mainly have sort of extroverted PTSD symptoms become upset. And what we see is a big activation of the insula. The insula is the part of the brain that tells you what's happening in your body. And when the insula goes crazy, you feel the problems in your body. I hope to have time, really running out of time, to show you more about that. The insula really, your body holds where the danger is, and then we do another study, and we show that when people avoid things, what goes offline is the temporal manipulated proactive junction. This is the part of your brain that tells you this is me or not me. This belongs to me or doesn't belong to me. So your sense of agency, your sense of awareness of yourself, of knowing your stand, is compromised if you go into shutting down phase. So there's very little there. And so what we more and more get into is not particular brain areas, but what is talking to what. What is connected in the brain with what other part. So, and what slowly becomes clear, and this is really the very latest thinking, I bet that most of you haven't heard about it yet, about how the brain needs to be in a different state to react and relate to the world around it. So you have a network of brain areas that's called the central executive network. It's crucial for learning, engaging, doing stuff, and taking action. There's a second network that tells you whether something is important or not, whether something is relevant or not. And there's a third network that has to do with who you are when you just pay attention to yourself. It's called the default mode network. All three of these networks are profoundly disturbed in trauma. And when you see how these networks change, you have no choice but to begin to reorganize your thinking in different ways. And so here are the three different networks. Salience, executive, and default mode. Let me just give you whether something is salient or not, whether something is important or not, depends on whether your body gives you a signal. This is important to you. And like, if I would tell you, there's a rainstorm outside right now, your inside would give you a message of when it feels you have your drenched clothes, your clothes drenched to be all cold. And you would start, before you go out, wrap yourself up and get an umbrella, even before you allow yourself to come back, because the message from your body is, I hate to be drenched and cold. And so that part of your brain that tells you how your body feels is always telling you, I need this, I need to order this on the menu and not that. I need to want to go to that restaurant and not that. I want to be with that person and not with that person. So that subtle body awareness is what drives us into what is relevant and what's important to us. This gets very damaged oftentimes in traumatized people, and you don't know where to go. You don't know what's important because that part of your brain is no longer giving you messages of this is what's important and this is what's not important. So what this tells us is that when you're traumatized and you have shut your relationship to your body down, you don't know where to go and you're floundering in the world. Gets worse. As it is your insula. When your insula shuts down, you no longer know what's important. And so there's two groups of people who do some research on it. One is mindfulness people, Sarah Lazar, and her colleagues at Harvard, who put people through some lengthy meditation and yoga experiences, and what lights up, if you spend a lot of time so paying attention to your internal world, you can activate and open up people's insula. So the next piece is this one. Not a dead white guy. So back in 1872, towards the end of his life, Charles Darwin writes a book about what clearly is the most interesting thing in the world, namely, how do people get to be the crazy creatures that they are? And all these emotions that we have, how is this related to evolution, and is this an evolutionary phenomenon? And Darwin is both a boy, that means he used the latest technology of his day, and he's also a member of the British Empire, which at that time covers 2/3 of the globe. And so he sends pictures, letters all around the world, and says, I would like to have pictures of tribespeople, actors, kids, people, whatever you can find, engaged in different emotional displays. And then he's a wealthy man, so he puts all these pictures on the kitchen table. He says, interesting animals and kids and people from different cultures all express their emotions in the same way. And so this is a book that still exists. It's a beautiful book. And he says, men and animals all have the same senses, intuition, sensation, pleasure, and emotions. And this means that these things are hardwired. And then Darwin talks about emotions and what do we have emotions for. But before I go to that, I want to share this amazing observation that Darwin makes about trauma. And he defines trauma as getting stuck in avoidance or escape, which is a good definition. So he says, behaviors to avoid or escape from danger are clearly evolved to render each organism competitive in terms of survival, but inappropriately prolonged escape or avoidance behavior would put the animal at a disadvantage, and that successful species preservation demands reproduction which in turn depends upon feeding, shelter, and mating activities, all of which are the reciprocals of avoidance and escape. And that's why I think we find ourselves in this room on this beautiful Saturday afternoon in Montreal, because either you got stuck in avoidance or escape, or you were raised by people who got stuck in avoidance and escape, and that was the primary question of your childhood. How did I get the parents who do all these crazy things let me become a mental health professional to figure out my parents? Anybody is here for any other reason? That's why we do this stuff. And so, if I say the DSM committee, I would have wanted to introduce this phenomenon because it's been a very important part, and of course Mark talked about it this morning also, and that is how trauma expresses itself in the attachment system, in the way that people live together. And then Darwin shows all these pictures, and he says the goal of emotion is to determine the distance or proximity between different organisms. So if you're angry, you say 1 step closer and I'll bite you in the ass. And if you're joyful, you go like, come a little closer, we'll have fun together. And if you're depressed, you go like, will you please come over and help me? And so these are all things that have to do with the management of distance and closeness. So the goal of emotion is to affect physical movement to regain a state of physical equilibrium. And so now Darwin, for the first time, adds a new dimension to how we all were trained, because we were all trained to connect emotion with cognition. And how do you feel about it? And let's see if we can make sense out of this. And Darwin says, no, what does your body want to do, and how does your body want to move? And then he brings in the 4th dimension, which is critically important for the work that we do, and that's the vagus nerve. And so, way back there, before Louis Pasteur and Charles Bernard and Hans Selye, all these people who begin to spell this out, Darwin, this really smart guy, figures out about the vagus nerve. And he says, there's a nerve in the brain that runs from the brainstem into the body that determines how you feel. So he says, heart, guts, and brain communicate intimately via the pneumogastric nerve, the critical nerve involved in the expression of natural emotions in both humans and animals. When the mind is strongly excited, it instantly affects the state of the viscera. They go like, no kidding. I know that. When I get rejected, I feel it in my pit of my stomach. When I feel sad, I feel it as a heartbreaking experience. Yes, I feel this in my body. And what we also all know, because everybody in this room has been heartbroken and gut-wrenched, that as an adult, you don't put up with that nonsense. So if you're heartbroken, you go to your liquor cabinet and you drink something to make it go away, or you go to your dope dealing and you get some stuff to make it go away, or you go to your psychopharmacologist to make it go away, or you go to the nearest bar room and pick somebody up to make these feelings go away. So most of the behaviors that get people into trouble are behaviors to take care of their heartbreak and their gut wrench, and some of us can do it quite well. Actually, going to your yoga studio for the emergency session is not bad either. And here you get the big difference between adults and children. Because as an adult, if you're heartbroken or you got revenged, you have control over how you manage that. But when you're a child, you don't have a drug dealer or a psychopharmacologist to go to, and you have only 1 or 2 people who can make these feelings go away. And those are your caregivers. And if your caregivers are the source of your heartbreak or your gut wrench, you are screwed, because then you need to find a way of managing these unbearable sensations in your body. And how do kids do that? By cutting themselves, by banging their head against the wall, by torturing animals and all kind of stuff. And all of these behaviors that now are classified as oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, and all of these nonsense diagnoses are in fact attempts by children to manage the housekeeping of their bodies. And these things persist over time because the housekeeping of their bodies have become disturbed. And so, Darwin, here it is, the vagus nerve, it goes down here. First, it hits your back of your throat becomes dry, and it hits your larynx, and your larynx changes, it goes into your heart goes fast, it goes to your lungs, your breathing gets different, it goes to your gut, you get gut-wrenching feelings. So trauma is being played out in the theater of your body. And that's really where the action is, and all these networks that I just talked about are body-based networks in your brain. And then Darwin gives the last indication that gets completely ignored for the subsequent 120 years. He says there is reciprocal innovations between the heart and the lungs and the brain. And whenever the heart changes, the brain changes. Whenever the lungs change, the brain changes. Nobody pays any attention to that until people like Stephen Porges in the 1990s, who discovered that 80% of the fibers of the vagus nerve are afferent fibers. They run from the body into the brain. And if you take that really seriously, our practice will never be the same again. Because the primary way to change your brain is via how you move your body. So the dance therapist can be vindicated after all. Too bad it had to come from us and not from you guys. It doesn't mean you resolve your trauma. It means you can become calmer because you do dance therapy. Resolving your trauma is a different issue. Okay? You need to be careful and precise about it. One last thing. So about 20 years ago, a couple sets out from London, Ontario, to drive to Detroit, over Ontario 124. And as they do that, they drive into a whiteout, and as they can't see anything, they hit a patch of black ice, and then skid into the car in front of them. The moment they do that, a truck like this drives over the back of their car, and one car after another plunges into each other. Their car number 36 of a 78-car pileup, the worst car pileup in Canadian history. And this is a picture that was taken off the scene 2 days later. And so to give you an illustration of what these poor people have been exposed to. And so in the middle of all this is this couple. The car is flattened. They can't get out. The doors are stuck. They hear all these explosions. They see flames. They hear screaming people. And this is Dante's Inferno. They desperately try to get out. They can't. And at some point, a firefighter comes by with a fire canister, smashes the windshield of the car, opens it up. The driver can crawl out over the steering wheel. He turns around to his wife to help his wife. His wife is frozen like a zombie in her seats. They have to pull the wife out. They go to the side of the road. Ambulances come, take them to the hospital. They're medically checked up. They're fine. They're a professional couple who love their work. They go to work that day, and they think we're probably going to manage. I would have gone to work also. But their systems are in complete hyper-arousal, shut down disorganization, so they cannot sleep, and they try to drink themselves to sleep. They start quarreling, they start fighting. Things get terrible. After about 2 or 3 months, they go to the GP and say, we are completely losing it. Our life is falling apart since the car accident. It's so bad we're even willing to see a psychiatrist. And the GP says, oh, you're lucky we have this very good person in town, Ruth Lanius, but I have to warn you about her because she has access to the world's most powerful brain scanner, and she may require that you put your head in the cooker before she sees you. And they say, we'll do anything, we're desperate. And so they see Ruth, and Ruth said, I'd be happy to help you, but let me first take a scan of your brain. And so they put the guy, the driver in the brain first, in the scanner. First, they make a script that Ruth learned from me initially, and he has a flashback of a scanner, and this is his brain. Big activation, right limbic system. Little on the left, mainly on the right. What's also interesting, a fair amount of activation of his prefrontal cortex. That probably explains the fact that the guy keeps thinking, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And when he comes out of the scanner, he says, I felt terrible, I felt just like I felt during the car accident. I was convinced I was going to die. And so these cognitions that you have at the time of the trauma keep coming back as isolated fragments. But you don't know that they're fragments because they're thoughts that come to your mind. If you go to a nice old-fashioned therapist, that old-fashioned therapist tries to straighten out your thinking and say, you shouldn't feel that way, you're not going to die. And what you should say to your therapist is, I know I shouldn't feel that way, that's why I'm so damned ashamed of myself. But you see, are you familiar with that word that shows there's these two white holes? That's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And when I go into my trauma, my sense of time and sequences completely disappears, and I lose my sense of perspective because this is all there is. And so I came to see you and pay you good money for you to get my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on. And don't say, what is a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex? Because you'll immediately disqualify yourself from being able to do this work. So that's the big issue. You get stuck in this timeless reliving. And I'll show you one more tape, and I'll show you a video. And so that's him. Stuck in this timeless reliving. It's interesting. Who starts doing EMDR with him? And the explanation why his wife has frozen and why he has this more explosive form of PTSD is because as a child he had a perfectly happy childhood and this is his first trauma. But they start doing EMDR and what comes up is some memories of his mom being very cruel to him. And he wants to maintain his loving image of his mom. And he drops out of psychotherapy. And he still is quite traumatized. His wife, who starts off much worse, because she shuts down in response to the trauma. She shuts down again at the middle of the trauma. And people think the reason why she shut down is because she was 7, her dad split, her mom was really upset and really angry and impossible to live with, so she learned to shut herself down. Particularly when you do EMDR, you go like, stay there. Notice that. And people say, that's what I was thinking back then, but now it's now, and then it's then. And I happen to know from my research that oftentimes when people get into their trauma, they start feeling sick. We measure that and see that it's clearly due to the release of opioids in people's brains. So when you release opioids in your brain, you feel sick. So that is a sign for me that she has arrived at her trauma. Her body is beginning to relive it and all the different chemicals that were got released back then are being released again. As long as I can keep her quiet, that's just fine. But in my office, I would say, don't worry about it. If you need to puke, just there's a little garbage can then. But we sit in front of a lot of people, so I say, just over to you. Usually when you deal with traumatized people, you say, go back and look back at the girl who was being molested, or that boy that's being beaten. I said, how do you feel towards them? They say, I can't stand her. She was so compliant, she was so weak, she was disgusting. She brought it onto herself. That boy had no guts, that boy was just weak and whiny and disgusting. And what you run into is this deep self-hatred for the child within themselves that was not able to protect itself. And that becomes the big focus of treatment, is the self-hatred for the role that people played in their own abuse, in not being able to protect themselves or whatever happens. And that's where we get into IFS and into hypnosis. So this is a very unusual person because she had a trauma. As an adult, she can deeply feel compassion for herself and not blame herself. But usually when people are traumatized, they blame themselves. And it gets all so much more complicated. And we have reached our time limit. I wish I could show you all kind of other stuff because there's a lot of other stuff happening. But I think this is our time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.